January 10th, 1878. The day I laughed for the first time in 3 years. The day a strange woman from Boston fell headfirst into a frozen water trough on Main Street. The day I realized that maybe God had not forgotten me after all. My name is Caleb Rivers, and this is the story of how a terrible mistake became the best thing that ever happened to me. The morning started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Cold, silent, empty. I woke before dawn in a house that felt more like a tomb than a home, dressed in the darkness, and walked the frozen path to my workshop without seeing the sunrise. There was no point in watching the sun rise when you felt like you had died with it 1,000 times before. My workshop sat at the edge of Red Creek, Wyoming territory, a sturdy building I had constructed with my own hands back when I still believed in the future, back when I still believed in anything at all. The leather and oil smell hit me as I pushed open the door, familiar and grounding. This was my sanctuary, the only place where I could lose myself in work and forget, even for a few hours, the weight of grief that pressed down on my chest like a stone. I lit the lantern and surveyed my workbench, a saddle half finished, waiting for my attention, strips of leather soaking in oil. Tools arranged with obsessive precision because order was the only thing I could control anymore. Everything else in my life had spun into chaos 3 years ago and never recovered. 3 years. 1,095 days since I had buried my wife Margaret and our daughter Clara in the frozen ground behind the church. 1,095 days since I had felt anything resembling joy. 1,095 days of breathing, but not really living. People told me the pain would fade with time. They lied. I picked up my cutting knife and began to work, my hands moving through familiar motions, cut, stitch, shape. The repetition was a kind of meditation, a way to quiet the voices in my head that whispered all the ways I had failed. Failed to save Margaret during the long, terrible hours of labor. Failed to keep Clara alive when she had taken her last gasping breath just 3 hours after being born. Failed to be the kind of man who could survive such losses and somehow remain whole. The workshop was silent except for the sound of my knife against leather. No music, no whistling, no conversation with apprentices or customers. I had fired the apprentices a year ago. I could not stand their attempts at cheerfulness, their careful avoidance of anything that might remind me of what I had lost, as if there was a single moment of any day when I was not thinking about it. In the corner, barely visible in the lamplight, sat the cradle I had started building when Margaret told me she was pregnant. Oak wood, hand-carved, never finished. I kept it there as a kind of punishment, a reminder that I did not deserve to forget. My hand slipped. The knife bit deep into my palm, drawing blood. I watched it well up, dark red against my calloused skin, and felt nothing, just another scar to add to the collection. I wrapped it roughly with a strip of leather and went back to work. The sun was fully up when I heard boots on the wooden steps outside. Fast boots, running boots. I knew those footsteps. Joel, my younger brother, the only person in Red Creek who had not given up on me, though God knew he should have. The door burst open, bringing a blast of frigid air and my brother's worried face. Joel Rivers was 25 years old, 3 years younger than me, and in many ways my opposite. Where I had become closed off and silent, Joel remained open and optimistic. Where I saw only loss, Joel still saw possibility. It drove me crazy and also, in my better moments, gave me something to hold on to. If Joel could still find reasons to smile in this hard world, maybe the world was not entirely broken. But right now, Joel looked anything but optimistic. His face was flushed from the cold and something else, panic maybe, or excitement. Or, with Joel, it was often hard to tell the difference. "Marshal Brennan is looking for you," Joel said, breathless. I did not look up from my work. "Tell him I am busy." "Caleb." Joel stepped closer, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "There is a woman, from Boston. She just got off the morning stage." I still did not look up. "So? She says she is your wife." My knife slipped again. This time it cut deep, slicing through the leather and into my palm in nearly the same spot as before. Blood welled up immediately, but I barely felt it. The word wife had stopped everything. Stopped my breathing, stopped my heart, stopped time itself for one long, terrible moment. I looked up at Joel. "What did you say?" My brother had the decency to look guilty. His eyes would not quite meet mine, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot like he used to do when we were boys, and he had broken something and was waiting for our father to notice. I said, "There is a woman. She came on the stage from Cheyenne. She has 3 trunks and a birdcage, and she told Marshal Brennan that she is here to marry you, that you sent for her." The workshop was very quiet. Outside I could hear the wind picking up the way it did on the coldest days, howling through the spaces between buildings like something alive and hungry. "What did you do, Joel?" My voice came out quieter than I expected. Quieter and more dangerous. Joel heard it and took a step back. "Caleb, listen to me. You have been dying. For 3 years I have watched you disappear a little more each day. You do not eat, you do not sleep, you do not talk to anyone. You are killing yourself. And I could not just stand by and watch anymore." "What did you do?" Joel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. "I wrote to a mail-order bride agency in Boston. I told them about you, about the ranch, about Wyoming, about how you needed someone. I might have used some of Margaret's old letters as a template. I thought if you met someone, if you just had a reason to try again, you might remember that life is worth living." The world seemed to tilt sideways. My brother, my own blood, had gone behind my back and arranged for a stranger to travel halfway across the country based on lies. Had used Margaret's words, her voice, her way of seeing the world, to lure some unsuspecting woman into thinking I wanted her here. I could have hit him. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I very carefully set down my knife, unwrapped the leather from my bleeding hand, and looked at the wound. It would need stitches. Just like everything else in my life that Joel touched, it would need fixing. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Main Street, with Marshal Brennan. Caleb, I am sorry, but I am not sorry. Do you understand? You were going to die if something did not change, and I could not lose you too. I already lost Margaret. I already lost Clara. I cannot lose my brother." Something in his voice made me look up. Joel's eyes were wet, his jaw tight with emotion, and suddenly I remembered something I had tried very hard to forget. A night about 2 years ago when I had been drinking, when the darkness had felt too heavy to carry anymore, when I had taken my father's old pistol and held it to my head. Joel had found me. Joel had talked me down. Joel had taken the gun away and never mentioned it again. I had convinced myself the next morning that it had been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much whiskey and grief, but looking at my brother now, I knew it had been real, and I knew why he had done this terrible, interfering thing. "Take me to her," I said. We walked through Red Creek in silence. The town was small, maybe 200 people on a good day, built around the fort that gave the area its protection and its purpose. Main Street was a wide dirt road, frozen solid now in January, lined with wooden buildings that looked stark and utilitarian against the endless white landscape of Wyoming territory. It was early still, not quite 9 in the morning, but already people were out. I saw Sarah Chen sweeping the porch of her general store, saw old Ben Tucker loading supplies into his wagon, saw Ruth Hadley stepping out of her fine carriage in front of the bank she owned. Ruth saw me and Joel and raised one gloved hand in greeting. I nodded back, keeping my face carefully neutral. Ruth Hadley, widow, landowner, the richest woman in Red Creek. For the past 2 years, ever since her husband died of pneumonia, she had made it clear that she would be amenable to marrying again. Specifically, to marrying me. I had politely declined every invitation, every overture, every carefully orchestrated encounter. Ruth was handsome enough, practical, and wealthy. She would have made a sensible choice for a widower looking to rebuild his life. But I was not looking to rebuild my life. I was looking to survive it, one day at a time, and that was all. As we approached the center of town, I heard it, a sound I had not expected. A voice, high and very loud, screeching what sounded like profanity. "Damnation! Bloody hell! Damnation!" I looked at Joel. He grimaced. The parrot. Of course there was a parrot. The stagecoach sat in front of the general store, its horses still stamping and snorting clouds of steam into the frozen air. A small crowd had gathered, which was not surprising. Entertainment was rare in Red Creek in January. Any new arrival was cause for curiosity, but a woman traveling alone with 3 trunks and a screaming parrot was cause for spectacle. Marshal Tom Brennan stood at the center of the crowd, and next to him, looking absolutely terrified, was her. My first thought was that she was going to die. She was dressed for Boston in autumn, not Wyoming in deep winter. Her traveling dress was pale blue, far too thin for the weather. Her coat looked expensive, but completely useless against the kind of cold that could kill you in an hour if you were not careful. She was shivering so violently I could see it from 20 feet away, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her hat sat askew on her head, decorated with what might once have been flowers, but now looked like frozen debris. At her feet sat 3 large leather trunks, and a birdcage covered with a cloth that was not doing much to muffle the parrot's continued commentary on the state of the world. The woman saw me approaching and turned. For the first time, I got a clear look at her face. She was young, probably around 24, dark hair, though most of it was hidden under the ridiculous hat. A small, heart-shaped face with delicate features that would have been pretty if not for the fact that her lips were tinged blue with cold, and her teeth were chattering so hard I could hear them clicking together. But it was her eyes that stopped me. Green. Not the dark green of pine trees, but the bright green of new grass in spring, of things growing and alive and hopeful. She looked at me with those impossibly hopeful eyes and attempted what was probably meant to be a graceful step forward. Instead, her frozen skirts tangled around her legs. She stumbled, arms windmilling, and fell directly forward into the water trough that sat between us. The trough had been frozen solid for at least a week. She hit it with a sound like a tree branch cracking, sprawled across the ice on her stomach. The impact sent her hat flying. Her hair came loose from its pins, cascading down her back in a dark wave. The birdcage toppled over. One of her trunks fell open, spilling what I could only assume were undergarments across the frozen ground of Main Street. From beneath the cloth covering the cage, the parrot screamed even louder. "Bloody hell! Bloody hell! Bloody hell!" The woman lay there, spread across the ice, her skirts hiked up to reveal sensible boots and several layers of petticoats, looking absolutely mortified. And I laughed. I did not mean to. It burst out of me like something breaking, like a dam giving way after holding back floodwaters for too long. Not a polite chuckle, not a small sound of amusement, a real laugh, deep and full-bodied, coming from somewhere in my chest that I had thought was dead. The sound shocked me almost as much as it shocked everyone else. People on the street stopped what they were doing and stared. Sarah Chen dropped her broom. Ben Tucker actually took a step backward. And Joel looked at me like he was seeing a ghost, because in a way, he was. The Caleb Rivers who laughed had died 3 years ago along with Margaret and Clara, or so I had thought. The woman on the ice trough turned even redder, which I would not have thought possible given how cold she was. "This is not how I imagined our first meeting," she said, her voice shaking with cold and embarrassment. I quickly sobered, remembering the situation, but my face still felt strange from the unfamiliar expression. I stepped forward and offered my hand to help her up. "Miss, there has been a terrible mistake." She grasped my hand with her own frozen fingers. Even through my glove, I could feel how cold she was, how small her hand was in mine. I pulled her upright with ease. She was shorter than I had thought, the top of her head barely reaching my shoulder. Up close, I could see that her unusual green eyes were starting to shimmer with unshed tears as the reality of my words sank in. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not send for a mail-order bride," I said as gently as I could manage. I believe my brother may have done this without my knowledge or consent. I am very sorry you came all this way, but I cannot marry you." The tears spilled over then, tracking down her frozen cheeks. She pulled her hand from mine and wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that was both protective and defeated. "I see. Of course. I should have known it was too good to be true. The letters were so kind, so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe someone actually wanted me." Something twisted in my chest at those words. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. I knew what it felt like to believe you were not wanted, to feel like a burden on the world around you. Tom Brennan stepped forward, his marshal's instincts clearly at war with his sense of compassion. "Miss, maybe you should explain your situation." I looked at Tom, then back at the woman. "What is your name?" "Daisy," she said, bending to gather the scattered undergarments with shaking hands. "Daisy March. I was a teacher in Boston until circumstances made it impossible for me to remain. I used the last of my savings to come here. I have exactly $7.32 to my name, no family, and no prospects." She said all of this matter-of-factly while shoving lace-trimmed items into her trunk with complete disregard for folding, but I could see the way her hands trembled, and I suspected it was not entirely from the cold. The bird in the cage was still squawking indignantly, adding a surreal quality to the entire scene. "What is with the bird?" I found myself asking. "That is Penelope," Daisy said, as if that explained everything. "She is a parrot. She was my mother's. She is all I have left of my family." "Damnation!" the bird shrieked from under its cover, making Daisy wince. "She has picked up some unfortunate vocabulary from the sailors on the ship," Daisy said apologetically. "I am working on correcting it." I dragged a hand down my face, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. This was Joel's fault, all of it. My brother had created this disaster, and now this poor woman was stranded in Wyoming territory in the middle of winter with no money, no prospects, and a cursing parrot. "You cannot stay out here in this cold," Tom said, ever practical. "You will freeze to death." I looked at Daisy March, at her blue-tinged lips and shaking hands, at the hope dying in her green eyes. I looked at the pathetic pile of her belongings scattered across Main Street. I looked at the crowd of townspeople watching with varying degrees of curiosity and pity, and I thought about what Joel had said. "You have been dying for 3 years. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been. But that did not mean I could let this woman die too, even if her presence here was based on lies. "She can stay in my spare room," I heard myself say, "just until we figure something out. This is temporary, Miss March, just until the weather clears and you can go somewhere more suitable." Daisy stopped struggling with her trunk and looked up at me with those enormous green eyes. "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Rivers. I promise I will not be any trouble." Even as she said it, she took a step backward and collided with the birdcage, sending it sliding across the icy ground. The cloth flew off, revealing an indignant green parrot with a bright red head who immediately began screeching every curse word in her considerable vocabulary at the top of her lungs. Several passing townspeople stopped to stare. I could already imagine the gossip that would be flying through Red Creek by nightfall. Caleb Rivers, the grieving widower who had not smiled in 3 years, had brought home a clumsy woman from Boston with a foul-mouthed parrot. I gathered Daisy's trunks with the ease that spoke of years of physical labor, and jerked my head toward the end of the street. "My house is this way. Can you manage the bird?" "Yes, of course." Daisy scooped up the cage, cooing apologies to Penelope, and hurried after me as quickly as her frozen skirts would allow. Joel fell into step beside me, saying nothing, but I could feel his satisfaction radiating off him like heat from a stove. I did not look at him. If I looked at him, I might actually hit him, and that would not help anything. My house sat at the edge of town, a sturdy 2-story structure I had built with my own hands during the first year of my marriage. I had added every detail with care, thinking about the family Margaret and I would raise there, the life we would build together. Now it stood as a monument to all I had lost, and I spent as little time there as possible. I kicked open the front door and deposited the trunks in the entryway. The house was cold since I rarely bothered to keep more than a small fire going, and my breath fogged in the air. Daisy followed me inside, still shivering violently, and set Penelope's cage on a small table. "I will get a fire going," I said, already moving toward the fireplace in the main room. "There are blankets in the chest upstairs. The spare room is the second door on the right." "Mr. Rivers," Daisy began, but I cut her off. "We can talk after you warm up. You are half frozen. Get out of those wet clothes and wrap yourself in something warm." She nodded and made her way carefully up the stairs, leaving small puddles from her frozen skirts as she went. I focused on building up the fire, coaxing the flames to life with practiced efficiency. The domestic task felt strange after so long. I usually just ate cold meals at my workshop, not bothering with anything more elaborate. It was a good 20 minutes before Daisy reappeared, wrapped in what looked like 3 quilts, and with her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders as it dried. Her face had regained some color, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. She had clearly been crying upstairs. "Sit by the fire," I said, gesturing to one of the chairs I rarely used. I made tea. "You did not have to do that," she said softly, but she took the offered chair gratefully and accepted the steaming cup I handed her. She wrapped her fingers around it, absorbing the warmth. I took the other chair, maintaining what I hoped was a respectful distance. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, awkwardness settled over us like a heavy blanket. 3 years of deliberate solitude had made me forget the weight of another person's presence, the way silence could feel full rather than empty when shared. "I truly am sorry about the confusion," Daisy said finally. "The letters I received were so detailed. They talked about life in Wyoming, about the ranch and the horses, about wanting to start fresh but not wanting to do it alone. I thought I was entering into an agreement with someone who genuinely wanted a partner." "My brother wrote those letters," I said heavily. "Joel has been after me for months to move on with my life. I suppose he thought this was the solution." "Move on from what?" Daisy asked, then immediately looked mortified. "I apologize. That is none of my business." I stared into the fire for a long moment. I never talked about Margaret and Clara. Never. But something about this strange, clumsy woman who had traveled across the country based on lies made me feel like I owed her some explanation. "My wife and daughter died 3 years ago," I said quietly. "Margaret died in childbirth, and the baby only lived a few hours. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like someone else's life entirely." "I am so sorry," Daisy whispered, and the genuine sympathy in her voice made my throat tighten. "It is what it is," I said roughly. "Joel thinks I need to move on, find someone new, start over. He does not understand that I am not interested in replacing what I lost." "That is why you have not smiled in so long," Daisy said. It was not a question. I looked at her sharply. "How would you know anything about that?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "When you laughed earlier after I fell, the marshal looked like he had seen a ghost, and several people on the street actually stopped and stared. It seemed clear that seeing you laugh was unusual." "I have not had much cause for laughter," I said. "I imagine not." Daisy took a sip of her tea, then added quietly, "Though I suppose it is rather ironic that my complete humiliation was the thing to make you break your streak. I assure you that falling over frozen water troughs is not a regular habit of mine. Falling over other things perhaps, but not usually water troughs." Despite myself, I felt my lips twitch. "You admit to being clumsy, then?" "Oh, terribly," Daisy said with a weak smile. "My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow. I knocked over 3 vases and a grandfather clock in my last employer's home. Though, in my defense, the grandfather clock was already unstable." "That is quite a record," I said dryly. "I do try," Daisy replied, and this time her smile was a bit stronger. We fell into silence again, but it was slightly less uncomfortable now. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house and reminding us both that winter in Wyoming was not to be trifled with. "What will you do?" I asked finally, "if you truly cannot return to Boston?" Daisy set down her teacup and pulled the quilts tighter around herself. I honestly do not know. I suppose I should look for employment, but I have no idea what opportunities might exist in a place like Red Creek. I am educated and can teach, but I doubt there is much call for teachers on the frontier. There is a school, I said slowly. The teacher is a woman named Abigail Patterson. She might know of families needing help with children. And Sarah Chen, who runs the general store, is always looking for help, especially with inventory. That is kind of you to think of, Daisy said. I will inquire tomorrow if the weather permits. You should stay inside until this cold breaks, I said. You are not equipped for this weather. In the morning, I will see about getting you some proper winter clothes. You cannot walk around town in those thin dresses. I cannot accept more charity, Daisy protested. You have already done more than enough. It is not charity, it is practicality, I countered. If you are going to be here even temporarily, you need appropriate clothing. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of watching you fall on that water trough. Daisy's face flushed pink. You are never going to let me forget that, are you? Probably not, I said, and was surprised to find myself almost smiling again. From her cage, Penelope chose that moment to shriek "Hell and damnation" at the top of her lungs, making us both jump. I really am working on her vocabulary, Daisy said apologetically. Right, I said. I can see you are making excellent progress. As the afternoon wore on, we talked more. Carefully avoiding topics too personal or painful, I learned that Daisy was indeed 24 years old, had grown up in Boston, and had been supporting herself as a teacher since her parents died 5 years earlier. She had a quick wit when she was not devastated by having her marriage prospects literally fall through, and despite myself, I found her easy to talk to in a way I had not experienced in years. As evening approached, I excused myself. I needed to speak with Joel, and the conversation was not going to be pleasant. The cold had not abated, but my fury kept me warm enough as I stalked through the frozen streets toward the small room Joel rented above the workshop. I found him there, pacing nervously, clearly expecting me. Before you say anything, Joel began, holding up his hands, I want you to know that I did this because I love you and I am worried about you. The words I had been preparing died in my throat. Not because I was not angry anymore, I was furious, but because I could see the fear in my brother's eyes, the desperation that had driven him to do something so drastic. Instead of yelling, I asked quietly, "Why Margaret's letters?" Joel sat down heavily on his bed. Because they were beautiful. Because when Margaret wrote to you, she wrote about hope and future, and all the things worth living for. I thought if I could capture even a fraction of that, maybe you would remember what it felt like to want something again. You had no right. I know, Joel's voice broke slightly. I know I had no right. But Caleb, do you remember the night 2 years ago when I found you with Father's pistol? I went very still. I had convinced myself that night had been a dream. It was not a dream, Joel said, reading my expression. I walked in and you were sitting right there, gun to your head, so drunk you could barely stand. Do you know what you said to me? I did not answer. You said you were tired, that you had tried to keep going for my sake, but you were so tired, and you asked me to leave so you could rest. Joel's eyes were wet now. I took that gun away from you, and I have carried the weight of that night ever since. I have watched you every single day, terrified that I would come home and find you dead. So yes, I wrote those letters. Yes, I lied to Miss March. Yes, I interfered in your life without permission. Because the alternative was watching my brother slowly kill himself, and I could not do that. I could not lose you too. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. I had not meant to burden Joel with my grief. I had not meant to hurt him. But apparently, I had done both. What am I supposed to do now? I asked. She is here. She has no money, no way to get home, no prospects. Let her stay, Joel said, just for a while. You do not have to marry her. You do not have to love her. Just let her stay and see what happens. Maybe Joel paused. Maybe having someone else in that house will help. Maybe not being alone will remind you that there are still things worth living for." I left without answering and made my way back home through the frozen darkness. The house was warm when I entered, and I could smell something cooking. I followed the scent to the kitchen and found Daisy standing at my stove, still wrapped in quilts, stirring a pot of what looked like soup. "I hope you do not mind," she said quickly when she saw me. "I found some vegetables and salt pork in your pantry, and I thought I should make myself useful. It is not much, but it is hot." I should have told her she did not need to cook for me. I should have maintained proper distance and boundaries. Instead, I found myself saying, "It smells good. I cannot remember the last time I had a proper meal." "Then you should sit," Daisy said, gesturing to the small kitchen table. I sat feeling strange in my own kitchen and watched as she ladled soup into 2 bowls with the careful concentration of someone trying very hard not to spill anything. She managed to get the bowls to the table without incident, though she did trip slightly over the edge of the quilt trailing behind her. The soup was simple but hearty. We ate in silence for a while before Daisy spoke. "Did you speak with your brother?" "I did," I said. "He admitted to everything. He thought he was helping." "He cares about you," Daisy observed. "That much is clear." "He interferes," I corrected. "There is a difference." "Sometimes they are the same thing," Daisy said gently. After dinner, I showed Daisy how to bank the fire properly for the night. As she headed upstairs, she paused on the landing. "Thank you, Mr. Rivers, for everything. I know the situation is not what you wanted, but I am grateful for your kindness." "Caleb," I said, "if you are staying under my roof, even temporarily, you might as well call me Caleb. Then you should call me Daisy," she replied with a shy smile. After she had gone to bed, I sat alone in the darkened parlor, staring into the dying fire. The house felt different with another person in it, less empty, less like a tomb and more like an actual home. I found myself thinking about Margaret's journal, the one I had locked away in my desk drawer 3 years ago and never opened since. On impulse, I retrieved it and flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for, page 47. Margaret's handwriting, as familiar to me as my own. "Caleb, if something happens to me during the birth, I need you to promise me something. Do not let grief define you. Do not stop living. Find joy again. Love again. Life is too precious and too short to waste it in mourning. Promise me you will remember that you deserve happiness, even if I am not there to share it with you." I had not kept that promise. For 3 years, I had done exactly what Margaret had begged me not to do. I had let grief define every moment of my existence. But today, for the first time in 1,095 days, I had laughed. Because of a clumsy woman from Boston who had fallen into a water trough and brought chaos into my carefully controlled misery, and upstairs, probably already asleep, was Penelope the parrot, who chose that exact moment to screech damnation into the quiet house. Despite everything, despite my confusion and anger and the impossible situation Joel had created, I felt my lips curve into something that was almost a smile. Maybe, just maybe, God had not entirely forgotten me after all. The next morning, I woke to the smell of something burning. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, I thought I was dreaming. Then the acrid scent of charred bread hit my nostrils fully, followed by the sound of frantic scraping, and a muffled curse that was definitely not from the parrot. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs to find my kitchen in a state of chaos that would have been impressive if it were not so alarming. Daisy stood at the stove, wrapped in a shawl over her nightdress, her hair in a braid down her back, frantically waving a dish towel at smoke billowing from a pan. Flour covered the counter in what looked like an explosion pattern. Broken eggshells littered the floor. And Penelope, somehow freed from her cage, sat on the back of a chair picking at what I could only assume had been meant to be bacon. I cleared my throat. Daisy spun around, nearly dropping the pan. Her face was flushed from the heat of the stove, or possibly from embarrassment. A streak of flour decorated her cheek like war paint. "Good morning," she said with forced brightness. I was attempting to make breakfast. The emphasis on attempting was not lost on me. I surveyed the damage. So, I see. The bread got away from me. and the eggs were more difficult than I anticipated. And Penelope apparently knows how to open her cage latch, which is a new development that I wish I had discovered under different circumstances. "Damnation," Penelope agreed cheerfully, tearing off another piece of bacon. I walked to the stove and looked into the pan. What had once been bread was now charcoal. I took it from Daisy's hands and set it aside, then opened the window to let out the smoke despite the cold air that rushed in. "When was the last time you cooked?" I asked. Daisy bit her lip. "Does supervising children while they make tea count?" "No, then never. Not properly. My mother did all the cooking when I was growing up, and after she died, I lived in the homes where I worked. They had cooks. I never learned." I looked at her, this woman from Boston who had traveled across the country to marry a stranger who owned nothing but 3 trunks and a foul-mouthed parrot, who could not cook even the simplest meal. Common sense said I should put her on the next stage back east. Kindness said I should at least teach her how to survive a Wyoming winter first. "All right," I said. Lesson 1. Wyoming cooking is about not dying of starvation. It does not have to be fancy. It just has to be edible. Her face brightened immediately. "You will teach me? Do you want to eat while you are here?" "Very much so." "Then pay attention." For the next hour, I showed Daisy the basics. How to regulate the heat of a wood-burning stove. How to crack eggs without getting shell everywhere. How to know when bread was toasted versus carbonized. She was an attentive student, taking mental notes of everything I said, asking questions that showed she was actually thinking about the process. But she was also still remarkably clumsy. She dropped a spoon twice, knocked over the flour container again, managed to splash hot grease on her hand, which I had to immediately plunge into cold water while she bit back what I suspected were some words Penelope would have been proud of. Yet there was something endearing about her determination. She did not give up or get frustrated. She just cleaned up each mess and tried again. By the time we sat down to eat, the scrambled eggs were only slightly rubbery and the toast was merely dark brown instead of black. It was not good, but it was edible, and Daisy looked at the plate with the pride of someone who had just conquered a mountain. "I made breakfast," she said, wonder in her voice. "You did. It is not very good." "No," I agreed. "But it is better than starving." She laughed at that, a bright sound that seemed too big for her small frame. I will take that as a victory. We ate in companionable silence. Outside, the sun was finally rising over the frozen landscape, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a clear day, which meant it would also be bitterly cold. Good weather for staying inside. Bad weather for a woman with no proper winter clothes. After breakfast, Daisy insisted on cleaning up, and I let her, taking my coffee to the parlor where I could pretend to read the week-old newspaper while actually watching her move around my kitchen. She hummed while she worked, some tune I did not recognize. Penelope had been returned to her cage and was preening her feathers, occasionally muttering to herself in a way that sounded almost conversational. This was my house, I thought, the house I had built for Margaret. The kitchen where we had cooked together, where she had taught me her mother's recipe for apple pie, where we had made plans for the future. For 3 years, I had avoided these rooms because they hurt too much. But now Daisy moved through them with easy familiarity, and somehow it felt less like a violation and more like the house was waking up after a long sleep. I did not know how to feel about that. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Marshal Tom Brennan standing on my porch, his badge catching the winter sunlight. Tom was a good man, probably the closest thing I had to a friend in Red Creek besides Joel. He had been marshal for nearly 15 years, keeping the peace with a combination of common sense and carefully measured force. He was somewhere in his early 50s, weathered and lean, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that saw more than most people wanted them to. "Morning, Caleb," he said. "Thought I would check on your house guest. Make sure she survived the night." "She survived. Come in." Tom stepped inside, removing his hat. I could hear Daisy still in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes being washed. Tom glanced that direction, then looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "We need to talk," he said quietly, privately. I led him to my study, a small room at the front of the house that I used for the business side of saddle making. Invoices, orders, accounts, things I had neglected for the past few months because I could barely summon the energy to care. Tom closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "Ruth Hadley came to see me this morning. Of course she did. What did she want? To know about Miss March, who she is, where she came from, how long she is staying." Tom paused. "Ruth was not pleased to hear that you had taken in a mail-order bride." "Daisy is not my mail-order bride. Joel arranged the whole thing without my knowledge. I know that. You know that. But the rest of Red Creek just knows that a young woman showed up claiming to be your intended and is now living in your house. People are going to talk, and Ruth Hadley does not like things she cannot control. Let her talk. It does not change anything." Tom studied me for a moment. "Does it not? Because from where I am standing, you laughed yesterday, first time in 3 years. And you have got a woman in your kitchen humming while she does dishes. That seems like it changes quite a bit." I felt my jaw tighten. "What is your point, Tom?" "My point is that Ruth Hadley is a powerful woman in this town. She owns the bank, half the land, and has influence with the territorial government. If she decides Miss March is a problem, she can make things very difficult. Daisy is not staying permanently. As soon as the weather clears, she will find somewhere else to go." "Will she?" Tom's expression was serious. "Because I spoke with Sarah Chen this morning. Sarah says she could use help at the store, and she is willing to pay a fair wage. And I heard you mention that Abigail Patterson might have teaching work. Sounds to me like Miss March might be putting down roots whether you planned for it or not." I did not have a response to that. Tom was right, and we both knew it. Somewhere between agreeing to let Daisy stay temporarily and teaching her how to cook breakfast, I had started making plans for her to remain in Red Creek. I had not consciously decided it, but I had done it nonetheless. Tom sighed and put a hand on my shoulder. "I am not trying to cause problems, Caleb. I just want you to be aware. Ruth has been waiting for you to move on from Margaret for 2 years now. She expected that when you finally did, it would be with her. This situation with Miss March, it has caught her off guard, and Ruth does not handle being caught off guard very well." "Noted. Anything else?" Tom hesitated, then said, "There is one more thing. I need to tell you something. About Margaret." The change in his tone made me look up sharply. "What about her?" Tom walked to the window, his back to me. "This is not easy to say. Hell, I have been trying to figure out how to say it for 3 years. But with Miss March here now, and you starting to live again, I think you need to know." "Know what?" "I loved her," Tom said quietly. "Margaret. I loved her before you ever met her. I asked her to marry me, and she said no, said she had met someone else. A saddle maker with hands that could create beauty from leather and wood. That was you." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Tom had loved Margaret, had wanted to marry her. All these years we had been friends, and I had never known. "Why are you telling me this now?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. Tom turned to face me. "Because for 3 years I have watched you destroy yourself with grief. And part of me, a selfish, ugly part, wondered if Margaret had chosen wrong. If maybe she should have picked the safe choice, the marshal who could have protected her better, who could have gotten her to a doctor faster when things went wrong with the birth." "She did not choose wrong," I said. The words automatic. I know that now. Tom's eyes were steady on mine. "Because yesterday I saw you laugh. I saw you come alive for just a moment when you were helping that girl up off the ice. And I realized that Margaret chose exactly right. She chose the man who could feel deeply, who could love completely, who could create beauty even in the middle of all this harsh wilderness. You just forgot that about yourself for a while. She did not choose wrong, Caleb, but you did. You chose to stop living, and that was wrong." The words hung in the air between us. I wanted to be angry at Tom for his presumption, for his admission, for everything. But I could not find the anger. There was only a hollow ache where it should have been. "I am trying," I said finally. "I do not know if I can be the man I was before, but I am trying. That is all anyone can ask." Tom picked up his hat. "I will let you get back to your morning. Just remember what I said about Ruth. She is not going to let this go easily." After Tom left, I stood in my study for a long time, looking at the account books on my desk without really seeing them. Tom had loved Margaret. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, not painful exactly, but present. Another piece of the past I had not known about, another reminder that other people had their own griefs and losses that they carried quietly. I heard footsteps in the hall and looked up to find Daisy standing in the doorway, concern on her face. "Is everything all right?" I heard voices. "Marshal Brennan was checking on you, making sure you had survived your first night in Wyoming." "Have I? Survived, I mean?" I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was still in its braid, that streak of flour still on her cheek. She wore one of the quilts like a shawl, and her feet were in thick wool socks I recognized as having belonged to Margaret. She looked nothing like my late wife. Margaret had been tall and sturdy, built for frontier life even before she came west. Daisy was small and delicate, completely unsuited for the harsh reality of Wyoming territory. But she was alive. She was here. And against all logic and reason, I was glad of it. "You have survived," I said, "though the day is young." She smiled at that. "Well, I shall endeavor to make it through without burning down your house or causing any major catastrophes. I appreciate the effort." Daisy hesitated, then said, "I should go into town today to speak with Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Patterson about work, unless you think the weather is too severe. I will take you, but first we need to get you proper clothes. What you have will not keep you alive in a Wyoming winter. I cannot ask you to spend more money on me." "You are not asking. I am telling you. Consider it an investment in not having to explain to Marshal Brennan why I let you freeze to death." We spent the afternoon at Sarah Chen's general store. Sarah was a practical woman in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, who had come to Red Creek 15 years earlier and made herself indispensable through sheer determination. Her store carried everything from basic supplies to luxury goods ordered from back east, and she ran it with an efficiency that would have impressed a railroad baron. She greeted us with a knowing smile when we entered. "Miss March," she said warmly, "I heard about your arrival yesterday. Quite the entrance." Daisy flushed. "I have a gift for memorable first impressions." Sarah laughed. "I like you already. Now, Caleb said you need winter clothes? Let me show you what we have." For the next hour, Sarah outfitted Daisy with everything she would need to survive a Wyoming winter. Wool dresses in dark, practical colors, thick stockings, a coat lined with fur, boots that would actually keep her feet warm and dry, gloves, scarves, a sturdy bonnet that would not blow away in the wind. I watched Daisy run her hands over the fabrics with something like wonder, as if she had never owned anything so fine. It occurred to me that she probably had not. Teachers did not make much money, and mail-order brides were typically women with limited resources and fewer options. Everything she had brought with her fit into 3 trunks. This was likely more new clothing than she had bought in years. "This is too much," she protested when she saw the growing pile. "I cannot possibly accept all of this. You cannot possibly survive without it," I countered. "And it is not charity. You will work it off helping Sarah when you can." Sarah nodded. "I meant what I said about needing help. Inventory, customers, bookkeeping. I could use someone with education and good sense 3 days a week. The pay is not much, but it is fair." Daisy's eyes went bright. "Really? You would hire me?" "On the condition that you do not knock over my merchandise," Sarah said with a smile. "Caleb mentioned you have a tendency toward accidents." "I will be very careful," Daisy promised. "And if I do break anything, you can take it out of my wages. We have a deal then. You can start Monday if the weather holds." While Sarah was wrapping up the purchases, I noticed Joel in the corner of the store, ostensibly looking at tools but actually watching Sarah with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. Sarah noticed too, I saw the slight color that rose in her cheeks when their eyes met. Interesting. I had not known my brother had his eye on anyone, much less Sarah Chen. Red Creek was small enough that any relationship between a white man and a Chinese woman would draw attention and likely disapproval from some quarters. But Joel had never been one to care much about other people's opinions. From Sarah's store, we walked to the schoolhouse, where Abigail Patterson, a stern but kind widow in her late 50s, interviewed Daisy about her teaching experience. Abigail had been running the Red Creek School for nearly 20 years, teaching children from ages 5 to 15 in a single-room building at the edge of town. By the time we left, Daisy had agreed to help with the younger students 3 afternoons a week. Combined with her work at Sarah's store, she would have enough income to start saving money and supporting herself. As we walked back toward my house, Daisy was practically glowing with excitement. "I cannot believe it," she said. "I have work, real work. I can start supporting myself. You were worried you could not," I observed. I was terrified. Daisy pulled her new coat tighter around herself against the cold wind. "When I realized there had been a mistake, that you had not actually sent for me, I thought my life was over. I thought I would end up destitute or worse. But everyone here has been so kind, especially you. I have not been especially kind. I let you stay in my spare room and bought you some clothes. That is basic human decency, not kindness." Daisy stopped walking and turned to face me. "You let me into your home when you clearly wanted nothing to do with me. You helped me find work. You have treated me with respect and consideration, even though I am the living embodiment of your brother's interference in your life. That is more than basic decency, Caleb." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply nodded and continued walking. But as we made our way home through the snow, I found myself acutely aware of her presence beside me, of the way her face lit up when she talked about teaching, of how she had started to feel less like an unwelcome intruder and more like something I could not quite name. The realization unsettled me deeply. That afternoon, while Daisy was tending to Penelope's cage, the parrot suddenly let out a screech that was different from her usual cursing. "Burn the deed! Burn the deed!" Daisy's hands stilled on the water dish. "What did you say, Penelope?" The parrot bobbed her head, her bright eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "Ruth said burn. Burn the deed. Burn it all." I had been reading the newspaper, but now I set it down and crossed to the cage. Where did she learn that phrase? "I am not certain," Daisy said slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. "This morning before church, Ruth invited us into her home for a moment. She needed to retrieve her gloves from her study. I waited in the parlor with Penelope. The study door was not fully closed. I heard voices, but I could not make out the words clearly. "Burn the deed," I repeated, testing the words. "What deed would Ruth want burned?" Daisy shook her head. "Perhaps Penelope is simply combining phrases she has heard in different places. She does that sometimes. Sailors' curses mixed with bits of my mother's Bible verses." Perhaps, but something about it troubled me. Ruth Hadley was a careful woman. She did not speak carelessly, especially not about matters involving legal documents. And burning a deed, destroying property records, that was not simply suspicious. It was criminal. "I think I should mention this to Tom," I said. "It may be nothing, but given Ruth's ultimatum this morning, I would rather be cautious." Daisy nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We were already facing Silas Hartwell's arrival in 20 days, my debt to Ruth in 30, and now possibly evidence of document destruction. The problems were piling up faster than we could address them. "One crisis at a time," I said, echoing my own words from earlier. But even as I said it, I wondered if we were running out of time to solve any of them. That evening, Joel came by for dinner, bringing fresh bread from the bakery and an expression of wary hope. I had not spoken to him since our confrontation the previous night, and the tension was obvious. We ate in awkward silence at first, the only sound the clatter of silverware and Penelope's occasional mutter from her cage in the corner. Finally, Joel set down his fork and looked at both Daisy and me. "I wanted to apologize properly," he said, "to both of you. What I did was wrong and selfish. I should not have forged those letters or made promises in Caleb's name. Daisy, I am truly sorry for putting you in such a terrible position." "I appreciate your apology," Daisy said graciously, "though I confess I am curious about why you thought this would work." Joel glanced at me before answering. "Because the man who wrote those letters, or whose words I borrowed, is who my brother used to be. Before Margaret died, Caleb was the kind of person who saw beauty in the world. He smiled and laughed. He made plans for the future. I wanted to remind him that person still exists somewhere inside him." "Joel," I began, but my brother held up a hand. "I know you are angry with me, and you have every right to be. But I do not regret trying to help you even if my methods were misguided. You are my brother, and I will always fight to bring you back to life, even when you do not want me to." I felt my throat tighten. "There is," I started to say, but Daisy interrupted gently. "There is," she said softly. We both turned to look at her in surprise. She twisted her hands nervously but continued, "You laughed when I fell. You helped me even though you did not have to. You are still capable of kindness and humor and connection. That person Joel is talking about is not gone. He is just buried under grief." "It is not that simple," I said roughly. "No, it is not," Daisy agreed. "Grief is complicated and messy, and it does not follow any timeline, but that does not mean you have to let it consume you forever." The three of us had dinner together, and though it was awkward at first, eventually the conversation began to flow more naturally. Joel told stories about the townspeople who came through the workshop, making us both laugh with his impressions. Daisy shared tales from her teaching days that were equal parts amusing and horrifying. And I found myself participating more than I had in years, adding my own comments and observations. When Joel finally left, promising to stop interfering, but making no promises to stop worrying, Daisy began cleaning up the dinner dishes. I moved to help her, and we worked side by side in comfortable silence. "Your brother loves you very much," Daisy said as she handed me a plate to dry. "I know. That is what makes it so hard to stay angry with him. You do not have to stop being angry. But maybe you can also acknowledge that his heart was in the right place, even if his actions were misguided." I dried the plate and set it aside. "When did you become so wise?" "I am not wise," Daisy said with a self-deprecating smile. "I just know what it is like to have your life torn apart and have to figure out how to keep going. After my parents died, I was so lost. I went through the motions for months, just existing, but not really living. It was not until I started letting people in again, started allowing myself to connect and care, that I began to heal." "And what if you lose them too?" I asked quietly. "What if you open your heart again and it gets ripped out?" Daisy turned to face me fully, her expression serious. "Then at least you will have had something beautiful, even if it was brief. Is not having loved at all better than never loving because you are afraid of losing? I do not know. Right now it feels like love is just setting yourself up for pain." "Maybe," Daisy said, "but it is also the thing that makes us most human. Connection, affection, caring about others even when it hurts. That is what separates existing from living." We finished the dishes in thoughtful silence. When Daisy excused herself to go to bed, I found myself standing alone in my kitchen, thinking about her words. I had been just existing for 3 years, going through the motions, but not really living. I had told myself it was enough, that work and routine could sustain me. But lately, with Daisy in my house and in my life, I had started to feel flickers of something more. Interest, engagement, even joy, as foreign as that feeling had become. It terrified me. I walked upstairs, intending to go to my own room, but found myself stopping outside Daisy's door instead. I could hear her moving around inside, the soft rustle of fabric as she prepared for bed. I raised my hand to knock, to say goodnight, to say something, but my knuckles never touched the wood. What would I say? What could I say? That having her here made the house feel less empty, that her presence reminded me of all the things I had tried to forget about what it meant to be alive, that I was starting to care about her in ways that felt like a betrayal of everything I had lost. I lowered my hand and turned away, but I did not make it far. Some instinct made me pause, made me lean against the wall just beside her door. And that is when I heard it. Crying, soft and muffled, like she was trying to keep quiet, but unmistakable. My hand went to the doorknob of its own accord. I should knock. I should check on her. I should do something other than stand here like a coward listening to her pain. But I could not make myself turn that knob. Because if I opened that door, if I went in there and offered comfort, I did not know if I could maintain the distance I needed to keep. I did not know if I could keep pretending that she was just a temporary house guest, a problem to be solved and sent on her way. So instead, I did something I had not done since Margaret died. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, my back against Daisy's door, and I simply stayed. I could not offer her words or comfort or solutions, but I could be there, separated by only a thin piece of wood, keeping vigil while she cried herself to sleep. I did not know how long I sat there, long enough for my legs to go numb, long enough for the crying on the other side of the door to quiet and stop, long enough for the house to settle into the deep silence of a winter night. And in that silence, I made a decision. I could not promise Daisy forever. I could not promise her love or a future or any of the things that mail-order brides were supposed to receive. But I could promise her this. As long as she was under my roof, she would not be alone in her grief. We would carry our separate sorrows side by side, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The next morning, I woke in my own bed with no memory of having moved from the hallway. My back ached and my legs protested as I stood, evidence that my late-night vigil had been real and not a dream. Downstairs, I found Daisy already in the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her smile was genuine as she looked up from the stove. "I am attempting eggs again," she announced, "with less catastrophic results than yesterday, I hope." I sat at the table and watched her work. She moved with more confidence today, measuring and stirring with deliberate care. The eggs, when she served them, were actually quite good. "You are improving," I said. "I have an excellent teacher." Daisy poured coffee and sat across from me. She looked like she wanted to say something, her eyes searching my face. "What is it?" I asked. She bit her lip, then said quietly, "I heard you last night." Outside my door, I went very still. "You did?" The floorboards creaked, and I could feel you there, even through the door. She reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "Thank you for staying." Her hand was warm and small and fit against mine in a way that felt both foreign and somehow right. I should have pulled away, should have maintained proper boundaries. Instead, I turned my hand over and squeezed her fingers gently. "You are not alone," I said. "Whatever happens, however long you are here, you are not alone." "Neither are you," Daisy replied, and something in her eyes told me she understood exactly what I meant. We sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the breakfast table, two damaged people finding unexpected solace in each other's company. Outside, the Wyoming winter raged on, cold and unforgiving, but inside, for the first time in 3 years, I felt the faintest warmth of something that might eventually become hope. Then Penelope chose that exact moment to screech bloody hell and damnation from her cage, shattering the moment entirely. We both laughed, and I realized with a start that laughing was starting to feel almost normal again. Almost. The following Sunday arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that turned Red Creek into something resembling a painting. Frost covered every surface in delicate patterns, and the sun reflected off the snow with blinding brightness. It was the first Sunday since Daisy's arrival, which meant church, which meant facing the entire town together for the first time. I had not attended church regularly since Margaret died. God and I had not been on speaking terms, and I saw no reason to sit in a building pretending otherwise. But Daisy had asked, her green eyes hopeful, if we might go together. She said she missed the ritual of it, the community, and I found I could not say no to her. So there we were, dressed in our Sunday best, walking down Main Street toward the small white chapel that served Red Creek's faithful. Daisy wore one of her new dresses, dark blue wool, that made her eyes look even greener. Her hair was pinned up neatly under a modest bonnet. She looked respectable and proper, nothing like the disheveled woman who had fallen into the water trough just days ago. People stared as we passed. Of course they did. Red Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and my business had suddenly become very interesting. The grieving widower who had not smiled in 3 years had taken in a mail-order bride and was now escorting her to church like a proper suitor. I could feel their eyes on us, could hear the whispers that followed in our wake. Sarah Chen gave us a warm smile and a small wave from the steps of her store. Joel, who had arrived ahead of us, looked positively delighted, and Ruth Hadley, stepping out of her fine carriage in front of the church, watched us approach with an expression I could not quite read. Ruth was dressed in black silk, still in mourning for her husband, though he had been dead for over 2 years now. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, tall and well-built, with sharp features and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. She had been trying to catch my attention for months, making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that she would be amenable to a proposal of marriage. I had been politely but firmly uninterested. Ruth represented everything sensible and practical. She had money, land, influence. Marrying her would solve every financial concern I had, but I did not love her, did not even particularly like her, and I had already made one marriage based on genuine affection. I could not imagine settling for less, even if love seemed impossible now. Ruth's eyes traveled from me to Daisy and back again. Her smile was polite, but did not reach her eyes. "Caleb," she said warmly, "how lovely to see you at church again. It has been far too long." "Mrs. Hadley," I replied with a nod, "and this must be your house guest." Ruth turned her attention to Daisy with the kind of assessing look a general might give enemy fortifications. "I heard about your dramatic arrival, my dear. You must tell me all about Boston. I have many connections there." I felt Daisy tense beside me. "Mrs. Hadley," she said carefully, "how kind of you to take an interest. Of course, we are a small community here. We look after one another." Ruth's smile sharpened slightly. "I do hope you will call on me this week. I would love to hear about your family, your background. I make it a point to know everyone who settles in Red Creek." It was not quite a threat, but it was not quite friendly either. I placed my hand on the small of Daisy's back, a gesture of protection and claim that surprised me even as I made it. "Miss March will be quite busy," I said. "She has employment with Sarah Chen and Mrs. Patterson, but I am sure she will find time when her schedule allows." Ruth's eyes flickered to where my hand rested against Daisy's back. "Of course. How enterprising. Well, I shall not keep you. Enjoy the service." She swept past us into the church, leaving a wake of expensive perfume and unspoken displeasure. "She does not like me," Daisy said quietly as we climbed the church steps. "She does not like anything she cannot control. Do not let it trouble you." But I could see that it did trouble her, and I could not blame her for it. Ruth Hadley was not a woman to cross lightly. The church was nearly full when we entered. I led Daisy to a pew near the back. Oh, back, the same one I used to share with Margaret. For a moment, sitting there with another woman beside me, I felt the sharp stab of guilt. But then Daisy's shoulder brushed mine as she settled into the seat, and I reminded myself that Margaret had asked me not to spend my life in mourning. Reverend Walsh began the service with a prayer, his voice carrying through the small building with practiced ease. He was a good man, Walsh, patient and kind. He had buried Margaret and Clara, had tried to comfort me in those terrible first weeks. I had not made it easy for him. The sermon was about forgiveness and grace, about letting go of past hurts and opening oneself to new blessings. Walsh spoke about the biblical concept of beauty from ashes, how God could take the broken pieces of our lives and create something new and good. I felt Daisy glance at me during this part, and I wondered if she was thinking the same thing I was, that maybe both of us were trying to find beauty in the ashes of our former lives, that maybe we had found each other precisely because we were both broken enough to understand. After the service, People lingered outside the church, talking in small groups despite the cold. This was the social heart of Red Creek, the place where news was exchanged and connections were made. I would have preferred to leave immediately, but Daisy seemed interested in meeting people, so I stayed. Sarah Chen introduced Daisy to several of the other women in town. Mrs. Patterson spoke with her about the teaching schedule. Even old Ben Tucker stopped to welcome her, his weathered face creasing into a smile as Daisy charmed him with questions about his ranch. I stood slightly apart, watching. Joel joined me, following my gaze to where Daisy was animatedly discussing something with Sarah. "She fits," Joel said quietly. "She has been here less than a week. Sometimes that is all it takes." Joel paused, then added, "Have you noticed how Sarah looks when she talks about books?" I turned to study my brother's profile. He was watching Sarah with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself once, a long time ago, the look of a man realizing he was falling in love. "Have you spoken to her?" I asked. "About how you feel?" Joel shook his head. "She is Chinese, Caleb. People already talk about her, about whether she belongs here. If I pursued her, if we became, well, anything more than shopkeeper and customer, it would make things harder for her, or it might make things easier. Having someone in her corner who does not care what people think," says the man who has been hiding from life for 3 years. Fair point. I looked back at Daisy, who was now being introduced to Ruth Hadley's circle of friends. The women were polite but cool, their assessment of her obvious. I would have to keep an eye on that. Ruth approached me a few minutes later, managing to separate me from the group with practiced ease. "Walk with me, Caleb," she said. It was not quite a request. We strolled toward the edge of the churchyard, far enough from others that we would not be overheard. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and I waited, knowing she would come to her point in her own time. "I want to speak plainly," she said finally. "That girl, Miss March, she is not suitable for you." I felt my jaw tighten. "That is not your concern, Ruth, but it is." Ruth stopped walking and turned to face me. "You owe me money, Caleb, $500, due in exactly 30 days. Do you have it?" "I am working on it." "Working on it is not the same as having it." Ruth's voice was calm, businesslike. "When the payment comes due, if you cannot pay, I will foreclose on your property. The workshop, the land it sits on, everything. You will lose it all. I know the terms of our agreement." "Do you? Because it seems to me that you have been rather distracted lately." She glanced back toward where Daisy stood talking with the other women. A pretty face and a tragic story can be very distracting, but distractions do not pay debts. "What do you want, Ruth?" She smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I want to make you an offer, a generous one. Marry me, and I will forgive the debt entirely. You keep your workshop, your land, your livelihood. Joel keeps his employment. Everything stays stable and secure." I stared at her, trying to determine if she was serious. In return for what? A loveless marriage? Love can be cultivated, Caleb. It is not the lightning strike that foolish girls dream about. It is a choice, made daily, to build a life together. Your Margaret is gone. You need a practical woman, someone who understands how this world works, not some clumsy child from Boston who knows nothing about frontier life. The answer is no. Ruth's expression hardened. "Then in 30 days, you will lose everything, and that girl will leave because why would she stay with a penniless man? She came here expecting a ranch, a successful business, security. When she realizes you cannot provide any of that, she will be on the first stage back east. Daisy is not like that. Everyone is like that when survival is at stake." Ruth adjusted her gloves with sharp, precise movements. "You have 30 days, Caleb. Think carefully about your choice." She walked away, leaving me standing alone in the cold. I felt the weight of her words settle over me like snow. She was right about the debt. I had been so focused on simply surviving each day that I had let the business side of things slip. Orders were behind. Accounts were overdue. I had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money, and now both were running out. I looked back toward the church and found Daisy watching me, concern clear on her face even from a distance. She said something to Sarah and then made her way toward me. What did she want? Daisy asked quietly. To remind me of my debts. Daisy studied my face, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she saw more than I wanted her to. We should go home, she said. You look like you could use some quiet. We walked back in silence. The festive mood of the morning completely evaporated. I was acutely aware of the timeline now. 30 days until I lost everything. 30 days to somehow come up with $500, which might as well have been $5,000 for all the chance I had of earning it in time. When we reached the house, Daisy went directly to the kitchen and began making tea. I followed, watching as she moved with increasing familiarity through what had been Margaret's domain. It should have felt wrong, should have felt like a violation. Instead, it felt almost right, as if the kitchen had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. She set a cup in front of me and sat down across the table. Tell me, she said. Tell you what? Whatever is making you look like the world is ending. I took a sip of tea to buy time, but Daisy waited patiently. Finally, I said, I owe Ruth Hadley $500. The loan is due in 30 days. If I cannot pay, she takes the workshop and the land. $500. Daisy's eyes widened slightly. That is a considerable sum. It is. And I do not have it. What will you do? I do not know. Work more. Take on extra commissions. Pray for a miracle. Daisy was quiet for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. Then she said, Is that why she offered to marry you? To forgive the debt? I looked up sharply. You heard that? The wind carries sound, and I was not that far away. Daisy met my eyes steadily. You should consider it. Consider what? Marrying Ruth? She could solve all your problems? She has money, influence, land. You would be secure. Joel would be secure. It makes practical sense. I felt something twist in my chest, something that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. Is that what you think I should do? Marry for money and security? I think you should do whatever keeps you from losing everything you have built. Daisy's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I am leaving anyway, Caleb. As soon as I have saved enough money, I will find somewhere else to go. I will not be a burden on you anymore. You are not a burden. I am a complication you do not need. Ruth Hadley made that very clear. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Ruth Hadley does not get to decide what I need. And you are not leaving. Why not? What reason do I have to stay? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning neither of us was quite ready to name. I could have told her the truth then. Could have admitted that the house felt less empty with her in it, that her clumsy attempts at cooking and her conversations with Penelope made me smile, that I was starting to care about her in ways that terrified me. Instead, I said, because you have work here, you have friends, you have a life you are building. That is not a reason, that is an excuse. Then what do you want me to say, Daisy? I want you to tell me the truth. She stood as well, facing me across the small kitchen. I want to know if I am just a temporary inconvenience or if I mean something to you. Because you mean something to me, Caleb, more than I should allow, more than is wise, but I cannot seem to help it. Her honesty stole my breath. I stared at her, this brave, foolish woman who had traveled across the country for a marriage that did not exist, who had fallen on her face in front of the whole town and laughed about it, who was now standing in my kitchen demanding truths I was not sure I knew how to speak. You mean something, I said finally, my voice rough. I do not know what yet. I do not know if I can give you what you deserve. But you mean something. Daisy's expression softened. Then do not ask me to leave. Not yet. Let me help. We can figure this out together. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Joel standing on the porch, holding a letter. This just came for Daisy, he said, handing it to me, from Boston. The letter was addressed to Miss Daisy March in careful, masculine handwriting. The seal on the back bore an initial I did not recognize. Daisy took it from my hands, her face going pale as she looked at it. "Who is it from?" I asked. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and read. I watched the color drain completely from her face, watched her hands start to shake. "Daisy?" She handed me the letter wordlessly. I read it quickly, my own hands tightening on the paper as I took in the contents. The letter was from a man named Silas Hartwell. He wrote that he knew where Daisy was, that he was coming to Red Creek to collect her. He claimed that her father, before his death, had signed a marriage contract giving Silas the right to wed Daisy in exchange for forgiveness of debts. According to the letter, this contract was legally binding under Massachusetts law, and Silas intended to enforce it. He would arrive in Red Creek in 20 days. 20 days. 10 days before my debt to Ruth came due. The timing felt like some cruel joke from a God who had already taken too much. I looked up from the letter to find Daisy watching me with desperate eyes. "I did not know my father had died," she whispered. "I left without saying goodbye. I thought I could write to him once I was settled, explain everything. But he died, thinking I abandoned him." A tear slipped down her cheek, and without thinking, I reached out and wiped it away with my thumb. "This contract," I said, "is it legitimate? I do not know. Father talked about it, about owing money to Silas, about how marrying me off would solve everything. But I never saw any papers. I never signed anything. It does not matter if you signed. If your father had the legal right to contract you in marriage, and if he did so before he died, it might be binding. Then I have to go back." Daisy's voice was small, defeated. "I have to return to Boston and face this." "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "You do not have to do anything. There has to be a way around this." "How?" "If the contract is legal, if Silas comes here with proof, what can I do?" An idea was forming in my mind, reckless and impulsive, and possibly the stupidest thing I had ever considered. But looking at Daisy's tear-stained face, thinking about her being forced into a marriage with a man she did not choose, I found I could not let it happen. "You can marry someone else," I said. "The contract would be void if you were already married." Daisy stared at me. "To whom? I have been here less than 2 weeks. I do not know anyone well enough to ask them to enter into a fraudulent marriage." "You know me." The words fell into silence. Joel, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, made a small sound of surprise. Daisy's eyes went wide. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I am saying that if you marry me, really marry me, then Silas Hartwell has no claim. The contract becomes meaningless. You would be protected, but you do not want to marry me. You made that very clear when I arrived. I did not want to marry a stranger my brother had ordered, like goods from a catalog," I corrected. "But you are not a stranger anymore, Daisy, and I am not going to stand by and let some man from Boston force you into something you do not want." "This would be a business arrangement," Daisy said slowly. "A marriage in name only, to protect me from Silas." I hesitated. "We could start that way, see where it leads. And if it leads nowhere? If we realize we have made a mistake, then we would deal with it when the time came, but at least you would be safe. At least you would have a choice." Daisy looked at Joel, who shrugged. "Do not look at me. I arranged one mail-order bride situation, and look how that turned out. But for what it is worth, I think my brother is finally doing something smart." Daisy turned back to me, searching my face for something I hoped she would find. "If we do this, if we truly marry, I need to know it is not just about saving me from Silas. I need to know that some part of you wants this for other reasons." I closed the distance between us, took her small hands in mine. "I am not going to lie to you and say I am ready for everything marriage should be. I am not healed from losing Margaret. I do not know if I will ever be completely healed, but I am tired of being half alive, Daisy. I am tired of existing instead of living. And when I am with you, I remember what it feels like to want something beyond just making it through another day. So yes, this is partly about protecting you from Silas. But it is also about me choosing to try again, to take a chance on something that might actually make me happy." Daisy's eyes filled with fresh tears. but she was smiling. "You are asking me to marry you." "I am. In a kitchen, with your brother as witness, with absolutely no romance whatsoever." "I can get down on one knee if you prefer," I offered. She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "No, this is perfect. This is us." She squeezed my hands. "Yes, Caleb, I will marry you." Joel let out a whoop of celebration that startled Penelope into a string of creative cursing. I pulled Daisy into my arms, feeling her small frame against mine, feeling her heart racing as fast as my own. This was insane. We barely knew each other. We were doing this for all the wrong reasons, or at least reasons that were not quite right. But as I held her, breathing in the scent of lavender from her hair, I found I did not care about reason or sense or what anyone else might think. For the first time in 3 years, I was choosing something instead of just letting life happen to me. And that had to count for something. "We have 20 days, Daisy said against my chest. 20 days before Silas arrives. Then we had better make them count." I pulled back enough to see her face. "We will need witnesses for the marriage. Tom Brennan can officiate. He has that authority as marshal. Sarah and Joel can witness." "What about Ruth?" Daisy asked. "She will not be happy about this. Ruth is going to have to accept it. I am not marrying her, and I am not losing my workshop. We will find another way to deal with the debt." "How?" "I do not know yet. But we have 20 days to figure it out. One crisis at a time." Joel cleared his throat. "I hate to be practical, but you should probably tell people soon, before Ruth hears it as gossip. She is going to be difficult enough without feeling blindsided." He was right. We needed to control the narrative before it got away from us. "Tomorrow," I decided. "We will tell people tomorrow. Tonight, let us just be." Daisy nodded against my chest, and we stood there in the kitchen as evening shadows lengthened around us. Joel quietly let himself out, leaving us alone. Penelope had settled into her cage, muttering softly to herself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but in Hud, wrapped in each other's arms, we were warm, we were safe. And for now, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Ruth's displeasure, Silas Hartwell's arrival, the debt that still hung over my head like an executioner's blade. But tomorrow was not here yet. Tonight, I had chosen hope over despair. I had chosen to try again. And standing there with Daisy in my arms, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could learn to be happy again. Even if happiness looked nothing like what I had expected it to be. 20 days after the letter arrived, Silas Hartwell came to Red Creek. I was in the workshop when Joel burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency. The stage just pulled in. "He is here." I set down the leather I had been working and stood. Daisy and I had married 3 days prior, a quiet ceremony in Tom Brennan's office with Sarah and Joel as witnesses. It had been practical, rushed, born of necessity. But when Tom had pronounced us husband and wife, and I had kissed Daisy for the first time, there had been nothing practical about the way my heart had hammered in my chest. "Is Daisy at the store?" I asked. "Yes, Sarah is with her." Joel hesitated. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No, this is something I need to do alone." I walked down Main Street with a strange calm settling over me. For 3 years, I had avoided conflict, avoided feeling anything too deeply because the alternative was drowning in grief. But now I had something to protect, someone to protect. And I found I was not afraid. Silas Hartwell stood in front of the general store, a tall man in his early 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. He wore an expensive coat despite the spring mud, and his eyes were cold as they swept over Red Creek with barely concealed disdain. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder, no doubt containing the contract he believed gave him ownership of Daisy's future. "Mr. Hartwell," I said as I approached, "I am Caleb Rivers." He turned, assessing me with the same dismissive glance he had given the town. "Rivers, where is Miss March? We have business to discuss." "Mrs. Rivers," I corrected, "my wife is inside the store." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then anger quickly masked. "Your wife." "We married 3 days ago. Marshal Brennan officiated. It is registered with the territorial government." Silas's jaw tightened. Then you have made a grave mistake. I have a legal contract signed by Daisy's father before his death, promising her hand in marriage to me in exchange for debt forgiveness. That contract supersedes any hasty arrangement you may have concocted. Does it? I kept my voice level. Because my understanding is that a marriage contract becomes void once the woman in question is already legally married to another man, not if the marriage was entered into fraudulently to avoid a prior legal obligation. Silas reached into his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of papers. I am prepared to argue this before any court you choose. But it will be expensive, Mr. Rivers, costly in both money and reputation. Is your mail-order bride really worth that trouble? Before I could respond, the door to the general store opened. Daisy stepped out, Sarah just behind her. Daisy wore one of the practical dresses we had bought her hair pinned up sensibly, and she looked nothing like the terrified woman who had fallen into a frozen water trough 3 weeks ago. She looked strong, determined. "Hello, Silas," she said quietly. "Daisy." His voice softened marginally. "I was sorry to hear about your father. He spoke of you often near the end." I watched Daisy's hands clench at her sides, the only sign of her distress. Did he? Because I was not there. I left without saying goodbye, and he died thinking I had abandoned him. "You did abandon him," Silas said, and there was genuine hurt in his voice now. "He needed you, and you ran away to chase some fantasy of a better life. And now I find you have married this," he gestured at me dismissively, "this stranger to avoid honoring your father's final wishes." "My father's wishes?" Daisy's voice rose slightly. "Or your wishes, Silas? Did my father truly want to sell me like property? Or did you convince a dying, desperate man to sign away his daughter to clear a debt you knew he could never repay?" Silas flinched. "It was not like that." "Then what was it like?" Daisy took a step forward. "Because from where I stand you have traveled halfway across the country to claim a woman who does not want you, based on a contract I never agreed to. What kind of marriage do you think that would be?" "A legal one," Silas said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Legal does not mean right." Daisy's hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. "My father owed you money. I understand that. But I am not currency. I am not something to be traded or bartered. I am a person, and I have made my choice. I chose Caleb." I stepped forward and took Daisy's hand. "She is right," I said to Silas. "Whatever debt her father owed you, we will discuss repayment. But Daisy is my wife. That will not change." Silas stared at us for a long moment. People had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices. I saw Tom Brennan standing on the boardwalk outside his office, watching carefully. Sarah had moved to stand beside Daisy, a quiet show of support. Finally, Silas sighed. He suddenly looked older, tired. "How much can you pay?" I had anticipated this. Daisy and I had pooled our savings, $300. It is everything we have. "The debt was $800, Silas said. "The debt was your gamble on a contract that no longer has value," I countered. $300 is generous compensation for your trouble." Silas looked at Daisy again, something unreadable in his expression. "Did you love him, your father?" "Very much," Daisy whispered. "He was a good man who made a bad decision when he was desperate. I understand that, but I cannot pay for his mistakes with my entire life." Silas nodded slowly. He reached into his satchel again, this time pulling out a small wooden box. He held it out to Daisy. "This was your mother's. Your father asked me to give it to you if I found you. He wanted you to know he understood why you left, and he was sorry." Daisy took the box with trembling hands. When she opened it, I saw a simple gold locket inside. She pressed it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she managed. Silas looked at me. $300, and we are settled. I want it in writing, witnessed by the marshal." "Agreed," I said. Within an hour, it was done. Tom drew up a document releasing Daisy from any claims under her father's contract in exchange for $300 payment. Silas signed. Daisy signed. I signed. Tom and Sarah witnessed. Silas left on the evening stage without another word. As we watched the coach pull away, Daisy leaned against me. "It is really over?" she asked. "It is really over," I confirmed. She turned in my arms and kissed me, there on Main Street with half the town watching. I did not care. Let them see. Let them know that the grieving widower had found a reason to live again. When we finally pulled apart, Daisy was smiling through her tears. "Take me home, husband." "With pleasure, wife." The confrontation with Ruth Hadley came 2 weeks later, 10 days before my supposed debt was due. Tom Brennan arrived at my workshop early one morning with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between satisfaction and anger, with an undercurrent of vindication. "Caleb, we need to talk about Ruth Hadley, about your debt." I set aside the saddle I had been tooling. "What about it?" Tom pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "After you mentioned what Penelope said about burning deeds, I could not shake the feeling something was wrong. Ruth Hadley is many things, but careless is not one of them. If your parrot overheard her talking about burning documents, there had to be a reason." I felt my stomach tighten. "What did you find?" Tom pulled several papers from inside his coat. I started by checking the land records at the territorial office. Your property deed should be on file there, showing Ruth's lien for the $500 loan. But the original deed was missing. The clerk said it had been requested by Ruth 6 months ago for verification purposes and never returned. "That could be innocent," I said, though my instincts told me otherwise. That is what I thought. So I went to see Sarah Chen. "Sarah, what does she have to do with this?" Tom's expression darkened. "Sarah worked for Ruth 5 years ago, before she bought the general store. She was Ruth's housekeeper and personal secretary. She left because she witnessed Ruth engaging in what she called questionable business practices. But Sarah never had proof, and Ruth is powerful." Sarah kept quiet. "Until now?" "Until I asked the right questions." Tom spread the papers on my workbench. Sarah kept copies of documents she thought were suspicious, including this. I looked down at the paper he indicated. It was a property deed, my property deed. The original, dated from when I had purchased the land, but there was something wrong with it. "This shows I own the property free and clear," I said slowly. "No lien, no loan." "Exactly." Tom pointed to another document. "And this is a copy of the loan agreement Ruth claims you signed. Notice anything?" I examined both papers carefully. The signatures looked similar, but not identical. The dates were wrong, and most damning, the loan agreement referenced property boundaries that did not match the actual deed. "This is fraudulent," I said, my voice hard. "Yes." Tom gathered the papers. "I believe what happened is this. You did borrow money from Ruth, but it was a smaller amount, maybe $100 or $200 for materials, unsecured. You paid it back within months. But Ruth saw an opportunity. She created a fraudulent loan document claiming you owed $500 secured against your property. Then she requested the original deed from the territorial office and destroyed it. Without that original deed, you would have had trouble proving the loan was false." "The burning," I said. "Penelope heard her talking about burning my deed." "Most likely." Tom stood. "Sarah is willing to testify to what she knows. Ruth's pattern of similar dealings with other property owners, the falsified documents, all of it." "Where is Ruth now?" "At the bank." Tom's smile was grim. "I thought you might want to be there when I confront her." We walked to the bank together. Several townspeople fell in step behind us. Word had spread, as it always did in Red Creek. By the time we reached the bank, we had a sizable crowd. Ruth was in her office, reviewing ledgers. She looked up when Tom entered, and her expression shifted from surprise to wariness when she saw me behind him. "Marshall, Caleb, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Tom laid the documents on her desk. "Ruth Hadley, I am here to inform you that I have evidence you have engaged in fraudulent business practices, including the falsification of loan documents and the destruction of property deeds." Ruth's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "That is absurd. Who has made these accusations?" "I have," Sarah said, stepping into the office. She had been waiting outside. "I worked for you for 3 years, Ruth. I saw what you did. I kept quiet because I was afraid, but I am not afraid anymore." Ruth stood, her hands pressed flat on the desk. "You have no proof. Your word against mine." "I have copies of documents you thought I never saw," Sarah said calmly. "Caleb's is not the only false loan. There are others. and I am willing to testify to all of it before the territorial judge." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Ruth looked from Sarah to Tom to me, and I saw her calculating, saw her realize that her carefully constructed empire was crumbling. "You," she said, looking at me with something like hatred, "you were supposed to accept my offer. Marry me. We could have avoided all of this." "I would never have married you, Ruth, not to save my property, not for any reason." "Because of her," Ruth spat, glaring past me to where Daisy had appeared in the doorway, "that clumsy nobody from Boston. You would rather have her than security, than power?" "I would rather have love," I said simply, "something you clearly do not understand." Ruth's shoulders sagged. For just a moment she looked old and defeated, then she straightened, gathering the shreds of her dignity. "What happens now, Marshal?" "Now you have two choices," Tom said. "You can contest these charges, in which case I will arrest you, and this will go to trial. Given the evidence and the number of witnesses, you will almost certainly be convicted. Or you can leave Red Creek, sell the bank, sell your properties, and go somewhere else to start over." "You are giving me the chance to run?" Ruth's voice dripped with bitterness. "I am giving you the chance to leave with your freedom," Tom said. "But if I ever hear of you engaging in similar practices elsewhere, I will make sure every lawman in the territory knows your name." Ruth looked around her office at the trappings of the power she had built through deception. Then she nodded once, sharply. "I will be gone within the week." True to her word, Ruth Hadley left Red Creek 3 days later. The bank was sold to a consortium from Cheyenne. Her properties were liquidated. And the woman who had tried to own me through fraud disappeared into whatever future she could salvage. That evening, I sat with Daisy in our parlor, Penelope muttering contentedly in her cage. "It is really over," Daisy said. "Silas, Ruth, all of it." "All of it," I agreed. She looked at me, her green eyes serious. "What now?" "Now," I said, pulling her close, "we live." 6 months after Daisy had fallen into that frozen water trough, we stood before the Red Creek community in the small chapel and spoke our vows again. The first ceremony in Tom's office had been about necessity, about protection and legality. This ceremony was about something else entirely. Reverend Walsh smiled at us from behind his simple wooden podium. The church was full, every pew packed with townspeople who had watched our unlikely story unfold. Sarah Chen sat in the front row beside Joel, who could not stop grinning. Tom Brennan stood as my best man, his weathered face softer than I had ever seen it. And Daisy, my beautiful, clumsy, brave Daisy, stood before me in a simple white dress that Sarah had helped her make, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers, her hand trembling slightly in mine. Reverend Walsh spoke the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, but when it came time for our vows, I had asked for a moment to speak my own. I looked into Daisy's green eyes and found my voice. When you arrived in Red Creek, I was not living. I was existing, going through the motions of life but feeling none of it. I had convinced myself that was all I deserved, all I was capable of. I cleared my throat, surprised by the emotion rising in my chest. You fell into a frozen water trough and made me laugh for the first time in 3 years. And that laugh cracked something open inside me, something I thought had died. Daisy's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I cannot promise I will never grieve for what I lost. Margaret and Clara will always be part of me. But I can promise that I will not let that grief stop me from loving you with everything I have. I can promise to catch you when you fall, to laugh with you, to build a life with you. I can promise that every day I wake up beside you, I will choose happiness. I will choose us." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ring I had made myself, hammered from silver in my workshop late at night while Daisy slept. It was simple but strong, engraved with a tiny water trough on the inside because I wanted her to always remember how we began. "Daisy March, I love you. Will you marry me? Again?" The church erupted in laughter. Daisy wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes, Caleb Rivers, again and always." I slipped the ring onto her finger, and then it was her turn. "I came to Red Creek because I thought I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I came looking for safety, for security, for someone who would want me, and I found all of that. but I also found something I was not looking for. I found home. She took my hands in both of hers. You taught me that home is not a place. It is a person. It is choosing every day to be present, to be vulnerable, to love, even when it is terrifying. You taught me that grief and joy can exist together, that we can honor what we have lost while embracing what we have found. And you taught me that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst mistakes. She grinned through her tears, or the clumsiest entrances. The congregation laughed again, and I found myself laughing too. I love you, Caleb, for who you were, who you are, and who you are becoming, and I promise to keep falling for you every single day. When Reverend Walsh pronounced us husband and wife and told me I could kiss my bride, I did so thoroughly while the church cheered. Penelope, who Joel had smuggled in despite the Reverend's protests, screeched from her covered cage in the back, "Happy ending, happy ending." The celebration afterward spilled out into the churchyard and then into the street. Someone had brought fiddles. Tables appeared laden with food that half the town had contributed. Children ran between adults' legs while men clapped me on the back, and women hugged Daisy with genuine affection. I found myself standing with Tom as the sun began to set, watching Daisy dance with Joel while Sarah laughed at their antics. "You did well," Tom said quietly. "So did you, with Ruth." Tom shrugged. Justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about giving people the chance to choose better. Do you think she will? I do not know, but we gave her the chance. That is all we can do. I thought about Margaret then, about the promise I had made to her in her journal, about how I had broken that promise for 3 years and how Daisy had helped me find my way back to keeping it. "Tom," I said, "thank you for telling me the truth about loving Margaret." He looked at me, surprised. "It helped," I continued, "knowing that even someone like you, someone strong and good, carried loss quietly. It made me feel less alone in mine." "We all carry something," Tom said. "The question is whether we let it bury us or whether we let it teach us how to live." Before I could respond, Daisy appeared at my side, breathless from dancing. "Come," she said, tugging at my hand. "Sarah says if you do not dance with your wife at your own wedding, it is bad luck." I let her pull me into the circle of dancers. I was not graceful, and neither was she, and halfway through the song she stepped on my foot and nearly sent us both tumbling, but we laughed and kept dancing, and I realized this was what Margaret had wanted for me all along. Not to forget, not to replace, but to live fully, love deeply, and embrace whatever joy could be found in the midst of a hard world. The dancing continued until well after dark. When Daisy and I finally made our way home, our house was no longer the tomb I had been existing in. It was warm with lamplight, filled with the promise of the future we would build together. 9 months later, on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the Wyoming hills, our daughter was born. We named her Clara Margaret Rivers. Honoring both the daughter I had lost and the wife who had given me permission to love again. When I held her for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around mine, I wept. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. Daisy, exhausted but radiant, smiled at me from the bed. "She is perfect." "She is," I agreed, "just like her mother." In the corner of the room, Penelope ruffled her feathers and let out a contented squawk. No cursing this time, just a soft, almost gentle sound that might have been approval. I sat on the edge of the bed, our daughter in my arms, my wife's hand in mine, and thought about the day Daisy had fallen into that frozen water trough. The day Joel's terrible, wonderful interference had brought this clumsy, brave woman into my life. The day I had laughed for the first time in 3 years and started learning how to live again. "Thank you," I whispered to Daisy. "For what?" "For falling," I said. "For staying. For teaching me that second chances are real." She squeezed my hand. "Thank you for catching me." "Always," I promised. "Always." And somewhere in whatever place souls go to rest, I like to think that Margaret was smiling too. The end.